Rain had been falling over Seoul since midnight, and it showed no sign of stopping. Inside the police station, one of those buildings that never quite went dark no matter the hour, fluorescent lights hummed steadily overhead, throwing a flat, clinical glow across every surface. In one of the smaller interrogation rooms near the back, a woman named Clair Johnson sat with her hands folded so tightly on the metal table that her knuckles had gone pale beneath her brown skin. She had been sitting there for over an hour, though it felt like considerably longer, the kind of time that stretches and warps when a person is waiting for the worst thing that has ever happened to them to fully arrive. Her laptop was gone. Her phone was gone. Everything that had once made her feel like herself, the small tools of a life she had built with her own two hands, had been placed into a plastic evidence bag and carried out of the room by a stranger in a uniform who wouldn't meet her eyes. She had watched it happen almost outside of herself, as though she were observing someone else's life being dismantled piece by piece. Across from her, an investigator, a heavy-set man in his 50s with tired eyes and the flat affect of someone who had done this exact thing to hundreds of other people, slid a folder forward across the table. Inside it were numbers that did not belong to her life. 3.2 billion won. Gone. Moved out of the company's accounts in the middle of the night, using her credentials, her login, her name. She kept saying the only sentence she had left, over and over, the way a person repeats a prayer they no longer believe will be answered but cannot stop saying anyway. I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
I didn't do this.
But the words had already stopped landing somewhere around the 40th minute, because the room had decided who she was before she ever opened her mouth. And there is nothing more terrifying than being innocent in a room that has already made up its mind. The investigator did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply repeated his questions in slightly different orders, testing for inconsistencies that didn't exist because there was no lie to eventually trip over, only the truth, which nobody in that room seemed interested in hearing. Tell me again what time you left the building on Tuesday, 6:40. I already told you. 6:40, and I can prove it. There's a badge log. The badge log shows you re-entering at 11 p.m. I didn't re-enter at 11 p.m. I was asleep. I don't know how my badge would show that. The investigator only wrote something down without looking up, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the room besides the rain against the window and Claire's own uneven breathing. She had begun to understand, somewhere in that long silence, that facts were not going to save her here. Not on their own, not without someone willing to actually look at them. And then, at some point past 2 in the morning, the door opened, and the entire temperature of the room changed before anyone said a single word. He didn't need an introduction. Kang Jae-hyun did not walk into rooms so much as rearrange them around himself without effort. Every investigator in the vicinity straightened almost imperceptibly. Every voice in the hallway outside dropped an octave. He was the owner of the company Claire had given 3 years of her life to, a man she had seen only from across lobbies and through boardroom glass, a distant, immaculate figure who existed on a different plane of the company's ecosystem entirely. She had never once spoken to him directly, because men like him did not speak to people like her, not because he was cruel, because he was untouchable, insulated by layers of assistants and vice presidents and glass walls that ordinary employees simply did not cross. And now he was standing 3 feet away from her, looking down at the woman accused of stealing from him, and the investigator was already speaking before Jae-hyun had even fully entered the room. Mr. Kang, she is the primary suspect. The evidence is conclusive. Her credentials authorized the transfer, the funds were traced through. Jae-hyun did not answer him. He didn't even look at him. He looked at Claire instead, the way you look at something you are trying to solve rather than something you have already judged, and he asked her the only question that actually mattered in that entire room full of paperwork and assumptions. Did you steal from my company? The room held its breath, the investigator included. Claire lifted her chin, and even though her hands were shaking so badly under the table that she had to press them flat against her thighs to keep them still, her voice did not shake at all when she answered, "No." A silence stretched long enough to feel genuinely dangerous, the kind of silence that could break in either direction. Then, to the visible shock of everyone else in that room, Jae-hyun reached out, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat down like a man settling in for something that would take considerably longer than 5 minutes. Mr. Kang, the investigator, started again, clearly uncomfortable. "This isn't standard procedure. We can brief you separately once." "I'd like to hear it from her," Jae-hyun said, not unkindly but with total finality, the kind of tone that ended conversations rather than continued them. The investigator closed his mouth. "Then tell me what happened," Jae-hyun said to Claire, and for the first time in nearly 3 hours, someone in that building was actually asking instead of accusing. If you had told Clair Johnson 3 months earlier that the coldest, most guarded man in Seoul's business world would one day be the only person in an entire police station willing to listen to her, she would have laughed you out of whatever room you'd said it in. But life has a strange, almost cruel sense of timing, and sometimes the walls a person builds around themselves only come down when they are standing in the wreckage of absolutely everything else. To understand how Clair Johnson ended up in that room, accused of a crime that would have ended most people's lives before they'd even had the chance to properly begin them, you have to go back. Back before the arrest. Back before the betrayal. Back to a woman who had crossed an ocean not to be saved by anyone, but to prove, once and for all, to herself more than to anyone else, that she didn't need saving at all. Clair Johnson had grown up in Atlanta, in a small brick house on a street where the value of things was measured in effort rather than inheritance, where nothing was given and everything had to be earned through sheer stubborn will. Her mother, Denise, had worked double shifts at Grady Memorial Hospital for most of Claire's childhood, coming home some nights so exhausted she fell asleep still in her scrubs on the living room couch. And she told her daughter, more times than Claire could ever count, that the world does not owe you kindness, so you build your own worth so tall that no one, absolutely no one, can ever knock it down. Claire had carried that lesson with her the way some people carry a passport, always close, always necessary, always the first thing she reached for when things got difficult. She had studied international business in college on a partial scholarship, worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, and graduated with a kind of quiet, ferocious drive that unsettled some of her classmates and drew others toward her like moths toward something warm and steady. When the opportunity came to interview for a position at Kang Corporation's international division in Seoul, a company known throughout the industry for its exacting standards and its almost mythic difficulty to break into as a foreign hire, Claire did not hesitate. She flew to Seoul for the final round of interviews on money she genuinely could not afford to spend, sat across from a panel of 6 executives who asked her questions in rapid, clipped Korean specifically to see how she would handle the pressure, and answered every single one of them without missing a beat, because she had spent the 2 months prior teaching herself enough conversational Korean to survive exactly that kind of test. She got the job. She took it not because it was glamorous, and it certainly wasn't, not at first, not when she was the only Black American woman on a floor of nearly 200 employees, not when she spent her first 6 months being quietly, politely mistaken for an assistant, a translator, anything other than what she actually was. She took it because it was hard, and Clair Johnson had a strange, quiet hunger for things that were hard. The kind of hunger that had been carved into her by a childhood where nothing came easy, and everything worth having had to be fought for twice as hard as anyone else in the room. She learned Korean well enough within the first year to read contracts in it without needing a translator standing over her shoulder. She stayed late when no one asked her to, not to impress anyone, but because she genuinely wanted to understand every piece of the business she had signed up to be part of. She built a reputation, brick by brick, in a city that did not make it particularly easy for a Black American woman to be seen as anything other than a curiosity, an anomaly, a topic of quiet conversation in the break room that she pretended not to notice and mostly succeeded at not letting bother her. Her direct supervisor for most of those 3 years was a man named Director Choi Min-seok, 46 years old, handsome in the practiced, cultivated way of men who have learned over decades that charm is simply another tool in a professional toolkit, to be deployed strategically and withdrawn just as strategically. He was respected publicly by nearly everyone who had never had the misfortune of actually working directly beneath him, admired in company newsletters and industry panels for his supposed mentorship of junior staff. To Claire, in those early years, Choi genuinely did seem like a mentor. He praised her work in meetings, sometimes even in front of senior leadership, which she understood even then to be a rare and valuable currency in a company like this one. He told her more than once, over the kind of casual after-work drinks that were really just extensions of the office, that she was being quietly considered for a promotion that would put her in front of Kang Corporation's most important international clients permanently, a role that essentially no foreign hire below director level had ever held. He made her believe, slowly and carefully, over the better part of 2 years, that Seoul had a genuine place for her after all, that all the extra effort and the extra hours and the quiet indignities of being constantly underestimated were finally about to pay off. There was a night, only a few weeks before everything fell apart completely, that Claire would return to in her mind again and again in the months that followed, turning it over like a stone, once she finally understood what kind of man Choi Min-seok actually was underneath all of it. A wealthy client, an aging shipping magnate named Mr. Bay, who had been enormously pleased with a deal Claire had personally closed on the company's behalf, tried to press a small velvet box into her hands outside the office building one evening as everyone was leaving for the night. Claire had opened it just enough to see the unmistakable glint of what was almost certainly an extremely expensive watch, the kind of gift that comes wrapped in unspoken strings, the kind of gift designed to create a debt disguised as generosity. She smiled politely and refused it, and gently pressed it back into his surprised hands with a firmness that left no room for further negotiation. A colleague standing nearby, a junior associate named Yuna who Claire had always liked, laughed afterward and told her, half in admiration and half in genuine disbelief, that she could have bought herself an entire new apartment with whatever was inside that box. Claire had only shrugged, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder as they walked toward the subway together. Then I'd have to spend the rest of my life wondering what I actually owed him for it, she said, and kept walking. She didn't know it then, had no way of knowing it then, but that single sentence, spoken so easily and so instinctively that she barely remembered saying it by the following week, would later become one of the things that made a billionaire begin, slowly and reluctantly, to trust her, because it told him something that money could never buy and had certainly never managed to buy from anyone else in his orbit. That Clair Johnson could not be purchased, could not be quietly controlled, could not be folded into someone else's plan simply because the price offered was high enough, which made her, in the particular ecosystem of Kang Corporation, very dangerous to the wrong kind of people, and very valuable indeed to the right kind. The first crack in her ordinary, carefully built life came on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in early spring, while she was preparing documentation for a routine international transfer between the Seoul office and a regional partner in Singapore. She noticed something that didn't sit right with her, the kind of small inconsistency that a less thorough employee might have simply glossed over. A series of repeated payments, modest in individual size but consistent over nearly 8 months, flowing out to a consulting firm she had never once heard mentioned in any meeting, any planning document, any conversation in the nearly 3 years she had worked there. The payments were small enough not to draw the attention of anyone glancing casually at the books, but frequent enough and specific enough that something about the pattern nagged at her instincts. She brought it to Director Choi directly, expecting nothing more complicated than a simple, boring explanation, some legacy consulting arrangement from before her time, some regulatory requirement she simply wasn't aware of yet. Instead, for one single unguarded second, something flickered across his face that Claire would only later come to understand was fear disguised, badly and briefly, as irritation. "Don't worry about things above your pay grade," he told her, already turning back to his computer screen in a way that made it unmistakably clear the conversation was over. Claire was many things, but she had never once in her life been someone who let a locked door simply stay locked without at least trying the handle. That night, quietly, without telling a single soul, not even Yuna, she made copies of the transaction records onto a personal drive, printed a few key pages, and filed them away in a folder in her apartment that she told herself with only partial honesty was purely for her own peace of mind. She told herself it was simple curiosity, professional diligence, nothing more. She didn't yet understand, had no framework for understanding, that in the wrong company's particular ecosystem, curiosity of that specific kind can very quickly be treated not as diligence, but as a direct and personal threat. Choi realized within a matter of days, perhaps even hours, that Claire was asking questions that reached considerably further than her position technically allowed. Men who have spent years carefully constructing and maintaining a comfortable lie develop an almost animal instinct for recognizing the exact moment someone else gets close enough to see the seams beginning to show. He did not confront her directly. He did not warn her, did not give her any opportunity to back away quietly the way a kinder, more cowardly man might have. He simply began, with the same careful, methodical precision he had used to build every other deception in his professional life, to destroy her instead. Using system access that very few people at the company still remembered, he retained from an earlier, more technical role years before his promotion to director. Choi accessed Claire's employee credentials late one night, long after the office had emptied out, and authorized a fraudulent transfer that moved the missing 3.2 billion won through a chain of shell companies, each one layered carefully over the next, each one further obscuring exactly where the money had actually ended up. Then, with the same unnerving precision he applied to everything else, he arranged, through a contact whose name would only surface much later in the investigation, for physical evidence to be planted inside Claire's apartment. Small, damning, nearly impossible to explain away to anyone who hadn't already decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. He built piece by careful piece, an entire alternate story in which Clair Johnson was not the woman who had discovered the fraud in the first place, but the woman who had orchestrated it. The next morning, Claire walked into the office exactly the way she had for 3 years running, coffee in one hand, laptop bag over her shoulder, ready for what she assumed would be an entirely ordinary Tuesday. She never got the chance to sit down at her desk. Police were already waiting near her workstation when she arrived, standing with the particular stillness of people who had been told to expect someone and were simply waiting for confirmation. Her coworkers, people she had eaten lunch with for 3 years, people she had personally helped meet impossible deadlines more times than she could count, watched in stunned, frozen silence as she was placed in handcuffs in the middle of the open office floor, in full view of nearly everyone she had built her professional life around. She kept saying it over and over to anyone who would listen, though almost no one did. "I didn't do this. I didn't do this." Nobody answered her. Director Choi appeared in the doorway of his glass-walled office at the sound of the commotion, and for one terrible, suspended second, Claire searched his face for something, anything, that might resemble help. "Claire," he said, his voice trembling with a devastation he had clearly rehearsed, "how could you?" That betrayal cut considerably deeper than the metal of the handcuffs ever could have on its own. If you're feeling the weight of this story already building in your chest, if it's sitting heavy the way Claire's did in that office that morning, take a second right now and comment "I'm still watching," because it only gets heavier from here, and I genuinely want to know who's still with her when the truth finally comes all the way out. At the police station later that same day, alone in a small holding room before Jae-hyun had ever walked through the door, Claire used her one permitted phone call on a colleague she trusted deeply, A woman named Sujin. She had covered late shifts for more times than either of them could count, celebrated birthdays with, confided in during difficult weeks. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried another colleague. Silence again. In the space of a single devastating morning, 3 years of carefully built relationships seemed to simply evaporate, and Claire understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically like drowning, that she was completely and entirely alone in a country nearly 4,000 miles from anyone who had known her before all of this. Which brings the story back to precisely where it began, to the dim interrogation room, to the rain against the window, to the billionaire who had chosen, against every expectation in that building, to sit down across from her instead of simply walking away. Jae-hyun listened, without interrupting even once, as Claire walked him through everything. The strange repeated payments, Choi's flickering, unguarded reaction, the copies she had quietly made. And even though every single piece of physical evidence currently sitting in that folder pointed unmistakably toward her guilt, something in the specific way she spoke did not fit the profile of an actual thief. Thieves, in his considerable experience with people trying to deceive him, tended to defend themselves aggressively, to over-explain, to perform innocence in ways that felt subtly rehearsed. Claire was doing none of that. She wasn't defending herself so much as she was asking him, directly and without flinching, to look deeper than the surface of what he'd already been told. "Why should I believe you?" he asked her eventually, testing the shape of her conviction the way he tested everything, looking for the crack that would tell him it wasn't real. "You shouldn't," she answered without a moment's hesitation. "You should investigate properly. If I'm guilty, a real investigation will find that out. If I'm innocent, it'll find that out too. Either way, you don't have to take my word for anything." For the first time since he had walked into that room, Jae-hyun looked at her differently. Not with suspicion exactly, though the suspicion certainly hadn't vanished entirely. With something closer to genuine interest. Not the kind of interest a powerful man sometimes develops in a woman he happens to find attractive, though he would eventually, much later, have to admit that was part of it too. The rarer kind. The particular interest a sharp, careful mind develops when it unexpectedly encounters another sharp, careful mind in a room where he had expected to find only desperation and lies. He instructed his legal team, right there in the station, to open a full and independent investigation, separate from whatever the police were already pursuing. And against every instinct the department itself seemed to have, against the overwhelming weight of the initial evidence, Claire was released later that morning, pending the outcome of that review. But release, as it turned out, did not mean anything close to freedom. It meant something considerably crueler instead, a slow, grinding public execution that took place not inside any courtroom but almost entirely online, in comment sections and anonymous forums, and the kind of casual cruelty that spreads faster than any official statement ever could. Within hours of her release, her photograph had already leaked somewhere, taken from an old company directory. Comment sections filled rapidly with strangers who had never met her calling her a thief, a gold digger, an opportunist who had traveled halfway around the world, specifically to steal from a company that never should have trusted an outsider in the first place. She lost her job by the end of that same week, not through any single formal decision that she could point to and challenge, but through the slow, quiet erosion of an HR department that simply no longer wanted the liability of her name attached anywhere near their building. Reporters, actual reporters from actual publications, began waiting outside her apartment complex at odd hours. She stopped answering her door entirely, ordering groceries delivered, and leaving them sitting untouched in the hallway for hours out of a paranoid fear of opening the door to the wrong person. There is a particular, specific kind of loneliness that comes from being publicly punished for something you genuinely did not do. A loneliness sharper in some ways than grief itself, because grief at least has the basic decency to be understood and acknowledged by the people around you. Claire began packing boxes late one night, alone in her apartment with the television off and the city noise filtering faintly through the closed window, quietly planning her eventual return to Atlanta, telling herself that maybe, despite everything she had built, Seoul had simply never been meant for her after all. She stood at her window for a long time that night, looking out over a skyline that had once, not so long ago, made her feel like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she whispered the sentence that would come to haunt the absolute lowest point of her entire story. Maybe I was never supposed to belong here. It was around this same time that Jae-hyun did something that surprised even himself, something that didn't fit neatly into any of the careful, controlled categories he generally sorted his own behavior into. Through the company's legal department quietly, without a single word to the press, without attaching any condition or expectation to it whatsoever, he arranged temporary housing for Claire after learning, almost by accident, that her landlord had quietly forced her out of her lease under mounting pressure from the ongoing media attention surrounding the case. When she found out where the arrangement had actually come from, she was furious in a way that surprised even her. She told him, standing in the doorway of the small serviced apartment his people had arranged, that she didn't need charity from him or from anyone else. "It isn't charity," he said simply. "Then what is it?" He paused for a long moment, and for a man known throughout Seoul's business world for never once hesitating in front of another person, that particular pause said considerably more than his eventual answer did. "An apology," he said finally. It was the first small, quiet sign that somewhere beneath the surface of the official investigation, Jae-hyun had already begun to doubt everything he thought he understood about guilt, about innocence, and about how easily both could be manufactured by someone determined enough. He threw himself into uncovering the actual truth after that, not entirely for her sake at first, if he was being fully honest with himself, but because something about the entire case simply didn't add up cleanly, and men like Jae-hyun were constitutionally incapable of leaving a puzzle unsolved once they had noticed the missing pieces. His cybersecurity team, working late into successive nights at his direct instruction, eventually discovered something that fundamentally changed the shape of the entire investigation. The transaction that had supposedly been authorized using Claire's personal credentials had, according to the server logs, been executed remotely, from an internal company terminal, at a precise time when Claire's own badge records showed conclusively that she hadn't even been inside the building. Someone else had done this. Someone with legitimate internal access. Someone who had been inside the company the entire time, hiding in plain sight. Claire wasn't the criminal. She had never once been the actual criminal in this story. She had been the target from the very beginning, chosen with deliberate precision precisely because she had gotten too close to something she was never supposed to see in the first place. Jae-hyun began asking Claire directly to help him identify deeper patterns in the financial records, patterns that only someone with her specific institutional knowledge would likely recognize. What had started as a formal, somewhat stiff professional collaboration slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to feel like something else entirely. Late nights spent working side by side over spreadsheets and transaction logs gradually turned into conversations that had nothing whatsoever to do with fraud or fabricated evidence. He learned, in fragments offered slowly over successive evenings, about Atlanta, about her mother's exhausting hospital shifts, about the quiet promise Claire had made to herself as a young woman never again to let anyone make her feel small or disposable. She learned in turn that the particular coldness Seoul's entire business world seemed to fear in him wasn't arrogance at all, had never actually been arrogance. It was armor, carefully constructed over years, built by a boy who had inherited an enormous company far too early in his life, in the wake of losing a father he had never really gotten the proper chance to grieve. One night, well past midnight, exhausted from hours spent buried in documents that seemed to multiply the longer they searched, Claire fell asleep at the conference table without fully realizing it, her head resting against her folded arms. When she woke some time later, Jae-hyun's suit jacket had been placed gently over her shoulders, and he was sitting across the table from her, simply watching, an open folder forgotten in front of him. Their eyes met in the low light of the room, and for a long, suspended moment neither of them spoke, because some moments genuinely do not require words to be fully understood by both people inside them. There was a breath between them, a pull, the particular kind of charged silence that exists right before two people almost allow themselves to want something they both know they shouldn't. Claire looked away first, breaking the moment before it could fully form. "You're my boss," she said quietly, more to remind herself than to remind him. Technically, he answered, a faint, almost involuntary smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You're not currently working for me anymore." She almost smiled despite herself. That doesn't make it any less complicated. It didn't stop either one of them, in the days that followed, from continuing to feel it anyway. A low current running quietly beneath every late-night conversation, and every shared cup of coffee over documents that no longer felt entirely like work. As the investigation deepened over the following weeks, the truth revealed itself to be considerably larger and considerably darker than a single dishonest director acting entirely alone. Choi had not built this elaborate scheme by himself, however capable he clearly was of executing its individual pieces. A senior executive named Yoon Hee-rin, a woman close to Jae-hyun's own family and deeply embedded in the company's upper leadership for over a decade, had been quietly protecting Choi for years, feeding him sensitive information, helping systematically cover the trail of stolen funds through connections and access that Choi alone never could have arranged. Their shared goal had never simply been the money itself, considerable as it was. It was something considerably larger. They wanted Jae-hyun removed as CEO entirely, forced out by a board that no longer trusted his judgment, and framing an outsider, a black American employee with no powerful allies anywhere in Seoul's tightly interconnected business world, was the perfect mechanism to make him look reckless, careless, fundamentally unfit to lead the company his own father had spent decades building. Claire had not been chosen at random, as she had initially assumed. She had been chosen with deliberate care because Choi understood, with cold clarity, exactly how easily the world would believe her guilty on sight, and exactly how little anyone in a position of power would actually be willing to fight for her once the accusations began. Once Claire fully understood the entire shape of the conspiracy laid out before her, working alongside Jae-hyun's legal and cybersecurity teams late into successive nights, she managed to gather the final, genuinely undeniable piece of evidence, the one document that would conclusively expose everyone involved once and for all. But somehow, through a leak neither of them ever fully traced, Choi discovered what she now had in her possession. A message arrived on her phone late one evening, carefully disguised as an urgent, private meeting request from someone she still believed, mistakenly, that she could trust completely. Against every single instinct that should have stopped her, every warning bell that some quieter part of her recognized and chose to override anyway, she went. It was a trap. Claire was locked inside an abandoned office building on the outskirts of the city, her phone taken from her almost immediately, the heavy door sealed firmly from the outside. Panic rose steadily in her chest as the minutes stretched into an hour, and then into two, the building silent except for the sound of her own breathing and the distant hum of traffic somewhere beyond the boarded windows. But even trapped, even genuinely terrified in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be since the morning of her arrest, Claire did not stop thinking, did not allow herself the luxury of simply falling apart. Using an old, forgotten laptop left behind in a corner of the empty office, its battery mercifully still holding a partial charge, she managed, working quickly and carefully, to upload the evidence she had gathered to a secure company server before anyone could possibly stop her from finishing. Meanwhile, across the city, Jae-hyun realized something was seriously wrong the moment Claire stopped responding to his messages, first with mild concern, and then, as the minutes passed without any reply at all, with a rapidly escalating desperation that surprised even his own security team, who had never once seen him move with quite that level of urgency over anything. He traced her last known location using every resource the company's security infrastructure could provide, and when he finally broke through the door of that abandoned building, flanked by 2 members of his security detail, he found her sitting calmly on the dusty floor, exhausted, visibly shaken, but entirely unharmed and already quietly victorious. "I told you I didn't steal your money," she said, looking up at him from the floor. "I know," he answered, crossing the room quickly to kneel beside her. "How? Because I've spent the last several weeks actually learning who you are," he said simply. The evidence Claire had secured, once properly reviewed by the company's legal team and handed over to the appropriate authorities, exposed absolutely everything. Director Choi, Yoon Hee-rin, the carefully layered shell companies, the fabricated transfer traced conclusively back to its actual source, the planted evidence discovered in Claire's apartment. Every single lie unraveled publicly, methodically, and this time there was no remaining ambiguity for anyone to hide behind. Choi and Hee-rin were both formally charged within days. The financial records, once fully reconstructed, proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Clair Johnson had never been anything other than an innocent woman who had simply, inconveniently, noticed too much. Jae-hyun didn't hide behind lawyers or a carefully drafted written statement, the way most executives in his position would have. He stood in front of the cameras himself. At a press conference his own board had strongly advised him against holding personally, and told the truth without softening a single word of it. Clair Johnson was wrongfully accused because people believed she would be easy to blame, he said, his voice steady in a way that made the entire crowded room fall genuinely silent. "I was one of those people, at least at first. I'm not proud of that, and I don't intend to hide from it." He apologized publicly, without excuses, without the usual corporate hedging designed to protect the company's image above all else. And for the first time since the morning of her arrest, Claire watched her own name being spoken on national television not as an accusation, but as a genuine, unqualified vindication. In the weeks that followed, Claire made a decision that surprised almost everyone around her, everyone except Jae-hyun, who had come, over the preceding months, to understand exactly who she actually was beneath the polished professional exterior she generally presented to the world. She did not return to her old position, despite the company's formal offer to reinstate her with full back pay. She did not accept any of the various roles the company subsequently offered in an attempt to make amends. Instead, drawing on 3 years of hard-won expertise and a small amount of savings, she began building something entirely her own, an international consulting firm operating under her own name, built on her own reputation, on her own carefully considered terms. For the first time since she had first arrived in Seoul, she answered to absolutely no one but herself. Jae-hyun came to see her at her new office several weeks after the firm's official launch, not as her former employer, not as the man who had ultimately investigated and cleared her case, but simply as himself, stripped of every title either of them had previously hidden behind. He brought flowers, an oddly simple, almost old-fashioned gesture from a man who technically owned half of a downtown skyline. "You know I'm not your employee anymore," she said, watching him from behind her new desk. "I know," he said, "and I'm not interested in being anyone's billionaire girlfriend either if that's where this is going." He smiled, entirely unbothered by the warning in her tone. "Good." She raised an eyebrow, caught slightly off guard. "Good, because I don't want you because you're impressed by my money," he said, setting the flowers down carefully on the edge of her desk. "I want you because you're genuinely the only person I've ever met who looked at absolutely everything I have, all of it, and still expected me to actually prove myself to you anyway." Claire studied him for a long moment, the same steady, evaluating look she had given him across that interrogation table weeks earlier, the exact look that had first made him take her seriously as something more than just another suspect to be processed. "And what exactly are you trying to prove?" she asked. He took a slow breath, The kind of breath a man takes right before saying something he has genuinely never said out loud to anyone before. That I can be the man you actually deserve, he said. She didn't answer right away. She let the silence sit between them, the way she had let silence sit her entire life, refusing on principle to fill it just because someone else in the room happened to be uncomfortable with it. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached across the desk and took his hand. "You can start," she said, "by taking me to dinner." "Saturday?" he asked, smiling now in a way she had genuinely never seen from him before, unguarded and almost boyish. "Tonight," she said, and laughed. And for the first time in what felt like months, the sound was entirely unguarded. They left the office together not long after, walking out into a Seoul evening lit gold with early evening light. No longer CEO and employee. No longer suspect and investigator. No longer the woman everyone had briefly believed to be a thief and the billionaire who had almost let them destroy her before he'd bothered to look closer. Just two people who had found each other, unexpectedly and against considerable odds, in the wreckage of a conspiracy neither of them had ever seen coming, and who had chosen, deliberately and together, to walk out of that wreckage side by side. Because sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to a person is the very same thing that ultimately reveals who was always meant to stand beside them. Clair Johnson had come to Seoul to build a career entirely on her own terms, to prove, mostly to herself, that she needed no one's help and no one's permission to succeed. She never once expected that in losing nearly everything, she would find the one person willing to see her clearly at the exact moment when the entire rest of the world had already decided to look away. If this story moved you even a little, if you found yourself quietly hopping for Claire the way you might hope for someone you actually knew personally, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe, the way she ultimately came to believe, that the truth always finds its way to the surface eventually, no matter how long it takes or how genuinely alone you feel while you're still waiting for it to arrive, subscribe and stay close, because there is another story just like this one waiting for you next, and I promise you, it will not let go of you either.